Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me on this panel session. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes to go through. You've all prepared presentations. Each person will get around 8 minutes to present. We'll start with Jordi, and then we will have a short amount of time for questions at the end, which I will ask each of you. So, also, for our audience, this panel session will be available on the SmartPorts TV service. So if you need to catch up later, you can visit the website and do so. So hopefully, for all our panelists, everything is clear. Excellent. So let's begin. Jordi, please start us off.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me the floor to speak first in front of this very good panel and experts. I have prepared a presentation that I guess it will be shown on screen, but anyway, I will start right away without the presentation while they prepare it. The session today is about market trends that affect peers of the future. And when we speak about peers of the future, each port, and in our case, obviously, thinks about who they are today, no? And when we speak about the Port of Barcelona, we like to say that we are like 4 ports in one. We have our logistics port, we have our commercial and freight port, let's say, we have our passenger port, and we have our city port, no? We have like 4 ports in one. And which market trends affect each one of them, no? So obviously the situation is different depending on each of those supports, no? But to go very fast on this, I will like to give like a sentence for each one, no? When we speak about, and then try to develop a little bit further for each one of them. Logistic ports. Prospects are looking good. Okay, when we speak about logistics port, we speak about the logistics activity zone that we have in the port, 200 hectares full of warehouses from logistic companies, and the prospects look good. Why? Because of e-commerce, because of e-commerce needs very big warehouses, 40 meters high, very big, lots of demands in order to set up distribution centers close to cities in order to serve different markets. So prospects, logistics, market trends in logistics look good. I leave the freight port for the end. City port and passenger port. Okay, as you may know, these are 2 areas in our port and in most ports worldwide that have suffered a lot the pandemic, the COVID-19 crisis. Currently, we have no cruise traffic at all. Last year, we had more than 3 million passengers. This year, we have 0. No, so it's difficult to say that prospects looks good despite where we stand today, no? But let me be optimistic, no? If we overcome the COVID crisis we have today, let's say in 2021, which is the expectations with the latest news from the vaccines being developed worldwide, I think the prospects look good. In 2-3 years' time, passengers, activities in our old port are going to develop, and I think they will reach the figures they had in 2019. And when it comes to freight port, it's more difficult to say, no? When it comes to freight port, and when we are speaking Barcelona, an European port, the Spanish port, it's more difficult to say, no? The way we see it, we have seen in the last 10 years, since the financial crisis in 2008, we have seen a market that more or less it's stagnated, hasn't grown so much when it comes to containers, to cars, to liquid bulks, to solid bulks. Some traffics have grown, but in general, we haven't seen, we have reached the figures we had 10 years ago, but not much more beyond that. And the prospects in the future, if you look at digitalization, if you look at how people are consuming, no, or new generations, no, if you look at the movie by Steven Spielberg, no, Ready Player One, and you see how he foresees the future, no, if you see a circular economy, if you see a 3D printing, prospects in general, in terms of increase of traffic in European ports, I wouldn't say we are not going to see very big increases in the next years, no. So these are a general overview. If we go more in depth into freight ports, please go to the next slide, please. Here we have made a summary of the trends that we have identified in ports. So if we go at this slide, and focusing on freight ports, and as I said, no, the prospects when you look at the demand don't look extremely good in terms of increase in volumes. If you look at the sectors that might benefit from big increases in the next year, we have identified in our new strategic plan that will be approved in the coming weeks in the port, some sectors that might grow a lot in the coming 5 years, let's say: agro-food industry, e-mobility, clean chemical products, equipment associated to renewable energy, and a more transversal sector, which is e-commerce. If you look at negatively affected sectors, hydrocarbons, automotion, in the medium term, the prospects don't look very good, no? And if we look at the offer, no, what are we seeing in the offer in our region, no? So in the offer in our region, we see an overcapacity imports in the Mediterranean, no? Overcapacity that was already in place at the end of the first years of the 21st century. Now it's probably even more clear. We see vessels being bigger, but not that much. I think we're seeing, like the curves we're seeing with the COVID, the curve doing like this, planning a little bit. We see lots of digitalization, lots of efforts on sustainability. And this from a demand and offer perspective. And to finalize a little bit and leave the floor to my colleagues here in the panel, I would like to give 4 hints on the lessons learned by the COVID-19, which I think are very important, and I think my colleagues might share or not. If not, we can discuss about it. So what I think we can learn from this crisis: first, global supply chains are very reliable, despite what you hear sometimes in the newspaper. All supply chains, for instance, between Asia and Europe, have proven as very reliable. We haven't seen shortages of basic goods. Masks and some medical equipment is something very particular, but in general, we haven't seen shortage in supermarkets, etc., etc. So global supply chains are very reliable. Asia has proven to be more, I don't know if efficient is the good word to say, but has proven to be more adaptable to react to at least these disruptions. This disruption, is this a proof that they are more adapted to other disruptions in the future? I'm not sure, but in this case, they have proven to be more reliable, more fast, and more efficient. Obviously, digitalization is unstoppable, and the Smart Ports conference, I guess, and we have seen already, we're going to see more examples of this. E-commerce is unstoppable. We see some companies, there was a report released yesterday that companies, some very big Spanish companies, have doubled what they sell via the internet and the mobile in the last 9 months. So digitalization, e-commerce, unstoppable. And finally, and I leave it here, ports are an essential part of the prosperity of cities and countries. At the worst days of our lockdown here in Spain, there were a few things that remained open and functioning normally: hospitals, grocery and food stores, and ports, I would say. So we are a very important piece of the prosperity of our communities. And now that they show this last slide, let me finish. And this is our summary for our strategic plan for the next 5 years. And in this wall, what the Port of Barcelona wants to become and wants to consolidate in the next years is to become, in order to promote this prosperity in our community, to become a smart logistic hub. And we have identified a smart in a way that fits us. This is something that came out of the blue a little bit, but we have identified smart as being sustainable, multimodal, agile, resilient, and transparent in front of the society and in front of the community. And I think I've used up my 8-9 minutes, and I leave it here, and I leave the floor to my other panelists. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much for that, Jordi. And I think you may have preempted one of my questions towards the end there about lessons learned. So I might ask you again to pinpoint just one that may be the key later. Patrick, I know the International Association of Ports and Harbours has been working really hard this year to inform the industry on what's going on. So I'm keen to hear your presentation. So please take it away.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, dear colleagues. Nice to see you all. Greetings from Antwerp. I will start indeed with a short sort of overview of what the pandemic has done to the port sector globally. We've been tracing the impact since April already, and then I will go into sort of 4 main areas that I think will shape the landscape of ports worldwide in the years to come. And this is the first slide indeed that shows you the barometer that we've been keeping since April. 4 indicators: the impact on vessel calls, on hinterland connections, on warehousing capacity, and on the availability of workers. And sort of the blue bars that you see on this graph, they show the intensity of the impact compared to normal conditions. And it may be a little bit difficult to see on the screen, but what is clear from vessel calls, and that's no secret, I think, is that the impact is, of course, highest on passenger vessels, and particularly cruise. I think for the cargo vessels, we've been seeing a gradual improvement over time. And that's actually also true for the other indicators, especially hinterland connections. There's been really an improvement over time, although the last report, which we actually published only yesterday, shows that there is sort of an uptick again in delays, and that goes both for trucking, for rail, and for inland waterways. And that has to do, of course, with, I'm not at this slide yet, please stay on the previous slide. That has to do, of course, with the reopening of markets and current waves of restocking and stockpiling, and they've resulted in a huge sort of flow of containerized traffic, imports in Europe and North America, and also Asian ports doing very well. And that sudden surge has put pressure both on hinterland connectivity, but also on warehousing capacity. It's a barometer that we publish every month. It's freely available. You can download that also from our website. Next slide, please. Yeah, if we look at sort of 3-4 major issues that come out of this crisis and going forward, probably the first one is risk and resilience. The pandemic is the third crisis already of the 21st century. We had 9/11 first, and then we had the financial crisis. So business continuity beyond the normal operational risks that ports have is clearly going to be a priority going forward. And we see that also in our own work as international organization of ports, that for many ports, this is now becoming a real priority. A lot of ports apparently don't have business continuity policies that go beyond the normal operational risks. But I think with what we've experienced in those first 20 years of this century, it's not sort of a luxury and something that we do need going forward. Next slide, please. When the crisis sort of emerged, people were sort of getting worried about what is this going to do to our efforts on sustainability, and mostly the efforts in reducing emissions, and that of course includes the shipping sector as well. There was a concern that we might not reach the targets that, for instance, the IMO has set to reduce ship emissions and greenhouse gas emissions in particular. And indeed, it's clear that if we go for a business as usual scenario, we won't get there. IMO published a study in July, its greenhouse gas study, which clearly illustrated that if we stay on business as usual scenarios, we are not going to meet the target to reduce with 50% the greenhouse gas emissions of shipping compared to by 2050. A major challenge, and actually the biggest challenge, is a financial one. The recent studies have shown that the scale of the investment that will be needed to decarbonize the shipping industry is at least amounting to $1 trillion US dollars. And what is even more interesting is that 85% of those investments are in the supply chain. They're not on the ships. They're in the bunkering infrastructure, the whole supply chain, getting clean marine fuels to the ports and to the ships. And unfortunately, we haven't really, have a clear idea how this is going to happen. So this is really one of the major challenges the second major challenge that I think the ports industry, maritime industry in general, coming out of this crisis. Next slide, please. Now we are at the Smart Ports Conference, and of course we know that a lot of ports have seized that opportunity, and the 7 ports that are organizing this event are a prime example of that. But what it hides is that actually there is a majority of ports still out there where the level of digitalization is still rather poor. Ports that are out there that even don't offer the basic digital services. And it became very clear during this pandemic how vulnerable that makes ports that have to rely on paper and person-based interaction, especially in the ship-shore interface. What we did during the first half of October, and that's the slide that you see here, we conducted a survey among ports worldwide to assess the state of implementation of basic electronic data exchange requirements between ship and shore that are actually already mandatory today under the IMO Facilitation Committee. And what this graph shows is that there's actually only roughly 1/3 of the responding ports that have actually implemented these requirements. 1/3 is in the process of doing so, and 1/3 has not even started yet. What's even more worrying is that half of those who said that we're in the process or we're not ready yet, they said that they may take a year before they will be able to do so. And what are the major barriers to the implementation? It's not money, it's not technology, but it is the multitude of stakeholders that are involved in the processes. That makes it really complicated, apparently, for a lot of ports to move forward with the implementation. So that's really a call to action, I would say, to really move forward and accelerate digitalization. Finally, to conclude, and maybe bring a little bit of a provocative element to the discussion, if we could have the last slide, please. And that is about business innovation, again, a topic that we're dealing with in this conference. If I would be a bit provocative, and sometimes I like to be, you could argue that the last major innovation in the maritime sector was containerization. And it has been with us for almost 50 years, half a century already. And containerization, as such, is based on concept of standardization and economies of scale. And those actually go back, and if we can look at the slide again, those go back to the period of the gentleman that I had on this picture. If we can see him again, can we note the next one? Next slide, please. Yes, that is Henry Ford. And you know that he was famous saying you can have any car you want as long as it's black. So containerization, standardization, our business is a very volume-driven industry. The business models of container lines, but also ports, we're sort of obsessed with it. We express our performance, and I think Jordi knows this very well. We express it in boxes, we express it in tons, whereas perhaps we should look at other ways of creating value. I know that's something that, for instance, Port of Barcelona is very strong in. Other ports are also looking at different business models which move away from the classic volume-oriented focus. And maybe we should indeed see that also as a new challenge or a new opportunity coming out of this crisis. My counter says that I reached 8 minutes, so I would leave it here. And thank you for that opportunity, Beth. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. When you mentioned the last innovation being containerization, there was a lot of nodding agreement from your panelists, so maybe we'll pick up on that later, but thank you so much for that overview. So next, heading over to Drewry, Eleanor, Hadland, please begin your presentation.
Well, good morning, or rather good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to present on behalf of Drewry today. I'd love, obviously, to have been able to join you in person instead of virtually, but I'll have to imagine that I'm enjoying the sunshine in Barcelona instead of the grey clouds of London. So, as Beth has introduced, my name's Eleanor Hadland, and I'm Drewry's Senior Analyst covering the ports and terminal sector. I've got more than 25 years' experience in the market, working originally for the UK's largest port operator, Associated British Ports. And when I moved into the consultancy sector in the early 2000s, since then I've been lucky enough to work on a range of port development projects and port sector transactions around the world with clients including port authorities, terminal operators, investment funds and multilateral finance institutions. So the COVID-19 pandemic has not surprisingly had a really major impact on the ports and terminal sector. And for this panel session, I've produced a brief summary of Drewry's latest market analysis to provide you with an up-to-date view of where the global container port market is today, and importantly, where it's heading. So the material I've shared today has been drawn from Drewry's regular container port and shipping-focused publications, primarily our quarterly Ports and Terminal Insight and our container forecaster reports. So on this first slide, Drewry tracks global port throughput on a monthly basis from a sample of over 235 worldwide ports, and that represents around 75% of global volumes. So this chart shows the rolling average 4-quarter growth rate across our global sample ports. And in the second quarter of 2020, it fell back into negative territory for the first time since the first quarter of 2016. But I think what's important is when we look at the pandemic, we need to remember that the rate of growth has actually been slowing down since the second quarter of 2018. And there was a number of other factors behind this. Increased protectionism was already impacting container trade before the outbreak, and these factors will endure and be there for us to deal with these challenges beyond the COVID-19 shock. I think my second point is that performance in the second quarter, when actually much of the world's population was in some form of lockdown, was actually nowhere near as bad as first feared, mainly because consumers who were unable to spend on services switched very enthusiastically, and trust me, I know this with my husband, to online shopping. And we saw an uptick in demand for home office equipment, gym equipment, and then as lockdown limited international travel, camping and outdoors equipment. So there is hope on the horizon. Our latest regional throughput indices, which are updated on a monthly and updated monthly and published free to charge on the website, provide clear signs of early volume recovery in several key markets. So the Chinese ports have posted a year-on-year growth each month since June, and there's been a really clear upswing in US containerized imports commencing in July. So the combination of relaxation of lockdown measures, but also combined with a fear of new restrictions being introduced. So importers are moving quickly to control their stocks in the face of the risk of a second wave outbreak. So this rush to restock has boosted the third quarter bounce back. As we're moving now, we're well into the fourth quarter, it's going to be much more muted. There's increased levels of supply chain disruption, there's a shortage of containers and slot capacity on the main trade lanes, and we're seeing the reintroduction of lockdown measures. So it's pretty abundantly clear that the economic foundations for any kind of sustained recovery at the moment have yet to materialise. So we'll now look at our latest global container port handling forecast, which was published at the end of September. Overall, we project that global port volumes in 2020 will be 3.3%, or around 26 million TEU lower than they were in 2019, falling back to around 775 million TEU. When we published this at the end of the third quarter, the risks remained heavily weighted to the downside. We saw the unwinding of government job support schemes, which were expected to lead to rising unemployment, with a consequential impact on household disposable incomes and therefore container trade volumes. But when lockdown measures do finally ease, we've also got a risk of transfer of household spending away from physical goods and back towards the service sector that we all miss so much. So our baseline forecast assumes containment of a second wave outbreak and a relatively soft landing as job retention schemes are wind down. And this results in a forecast of 6.5% growth in 2021. The downside scenario, which is linked to further negative COVID impacts, could trim throughput growth to around 2%. But the good news last week regarding the vaccine gives us hope that we can move towards our upside case, which assumes growth of almost 9%. So any early containment of the virus will provide a much needed boost to consumer confidence and could ease the economic burden of the crisis. But important not to underestimate the logistical challenges of a global vaccination programme. So our baseline 4-year forecast to 2024 remains at an average 3.3% growth per annum. And the gap in growth between a pre and a post-COVID world is fairly clear on the right-hand chart. 2020 will go down in history as very much a lost year of growth, and we don't expect to see this gap being closed anytime soon. So we're now going to look now, if we move on, to the slowdown in container volume growth and the impact that's having on terminal investment. So this slowdown in volume growth since the global financial crisis has already seen the rate of investment in new global container terminal capacity slow down. And this was a trend that was set to continue even before the pandemic. In recent years, we've also seen a marked shift away from greenfield terminals, with the major operators increasingly seek to expand existing facilities. Now, this is due to the changing risk profile of greenfield projects. So the private sector has been increasingly required to fund a greater proportion of the capital cost of the new terminal developments, but payback periods were getting longer because the slower rates of growth in the market weren't sufficient to enable really fast ramp up of capacity. So there's also been, importantly though, a slowdown in the growth of the global container fleet, but with fewer ships on order. But importantly, the upper size limit of the ultra-large container vessels has currently settled around the 24,000 TEU mark. And whilst larger vessels are still being cascaded into secondary and intra-regional trades, there's now a far greater alignment in capability terms between ports and the ships that are calling at them. And this is taking the pressure off port authorities and governments and operators to develop ever larger ports. So the COVID crisis has resulted in minor delays of projects already under construction, but the main impact is yet to be seen, and this will be seen over the next 2 to 5 years as work is halted on projects that are currently in the earlier stages of planning. Most operators have already announced that they're cutting back on non-essential capital expenditure until the current crisis draws to a close, And with a reduction in overall volumes, expansion projects are no longer seen as urgent or high priority. We're hoping that the sector's focus will shift further towards enhancing efficiency and upgrading capacity and capability at existing facilities to provide the best returns on investments. Whilst the maritime sector news has clearly focused, though, on the profits being made by container shipping lines during the crisis, there's been less attention paid to the leading terminal operators have all reported lower volumes and revenues in the first half of 2020 compared to the first half of 2019. And as terminal operators generate the majority of revenue on the basis of annual contracts, any fall in volumes impacts their bottom line. Vertically integrated operators have been offered some measure of volume protection, with APM terminals, for instance, reporting third-party volumes down by 17%, but volumes from Maersk were only down by 7%. The terminal operators have been very quick to implement cost control measures to support their profit margins. And Hutchison, APM, DP World, ICTSI all reference some element of cost discipline in their half-yearly update to their investors. But this is particularly challenging given the additional expenses that operators have had to face during the pandemic. They've had to change their operating practices to ensure they're providing COVID-secure workforces, and they've had to meet the increased of absenteeism as more and more of their workforce are either ill or self-isolating. Performance levels at ports have started to deteriorate, and nowhere more so than in the UK. But we need to see this rising level of congestion as something that's been building up over recent months. And the shipping line's aggressive capacity management strategy of service suspensions and blank sailings has stressed other points in the supply chain, with terminals and hauliers all struggling to cope with the peaks and troughs of demand. So, as referenced earlier, the reduction of non-urgent capital expenditure to preserve cash in the business is all part of a new terminal operator coping with COVID strategy. But despite this level of uncertainty, a number of the leading operators, including ICTSI and Costco Shipping Ports, have restated their commitment to achieving growth via strategic acquisitions. So the M&A sector is not dead yet. So finally, what is the outlook for the trends that are going to impact the sector beyond COVID? On the economic and market side, we see that the pandemic has acted to reinforce existing trends. Once COVID is contained, then we project that the market will still revert to lower average annual growth rates. And despite the change in government in the US, we still see ongoing risks relating to trade protectionism. And associated with this, we expect a shift towards regionalisation to continue. This will be further reinforced by e-commerce, which has led consumers to expect faster delivery, and therefore shorter regional supply chains are far better able to deliver than global supply chains, where it can take up to 2 months for goods to reach market. And these trends together will continue to limit greenfield projects in favour of brownfield capacity upgrades. So looking forward, the role of technology in ports is a key factor. One of the few upsides of the crisis has been the accelerated shift towards digital working across the broader supply chain sector. And this has enabled paperless transactions to take place in many countries where previously this was simply not possible. Deployment of automation technology in terminals will continue. But again, we expect that focus will be on automation existing operations rather than delivering greenfield new build automated terminals. Environmental issues will and should remain front and central on the agenda. The pandemic may slow the pace of change as both port authorities and terminal operators take stock of their capital expenditure plans. There's also a real risk that government funding and support for environmental measures may start to fall as the cost of the pandemic continues to mount. And that's it from Drewry. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor, for crunching the numbers, analysing the data and giving us an excellent outlook. Heading off to our final presenter now. Thank you very much for your patience. Yerzhan from Ecumene Ventures, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I know we're being watched by people from all over the world. We have other audience. This is great. My name is Yerzhan Nauruzbayev. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Ecumene Ventures. It's a Singapore transportation tech company, and we're building innovative solutions for the maritime sector. Personally, my experience in transportation tech dates all the way back to 2011. I held various roles on different continents and companies such as Breakthrough Fuels, Stage 3, Lane Hub, also financial group BCS. So I've lived and worked North America, Europe, and now my career took me to Asia, where we started this company. And our first product focuses on giving the shippers and the carriers the opportunity to very accurately calculate fuel costs and also CO2 emissions. And I know the previous speakers, Jordi and Patrick, they all talked about the emissions, the importance of sustainability in supply chain. And this is exactly what we deal with. And I think I've prepared a couple of slides, which if we can display on the screen, I'd like to walk you through. So this slide I just called Emissions 101. The audience probably knows most of this stuff, but I think it's great to just make sure we're all on the same page or we all aligned. So as you probably know, global maritime transportation sector is responsible for about 3 to 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that's very comparable to the global carbon footprint of Germany as a nation, as a country. Now, the greenhouse gas emissions, they come in, for maritime sector, they come in three main forms. The first one is sulfur oxide. And sulfur oxide has been regulated by the IMO. The latest regulation, IMO 2020, as of January 1st, 2020, the maximum sulfur content of marine fuel on the high seas dropped sevenfold from 3.5% to 0.5%, a very major decrease. We also, of course, as part of the sulfur oxide regulations, we have what is called the emission control areas or sulfur emission control areas. Obviously, these are the areas where the vessel has to switch from, the high sulfur content fuel to 0.1% fuel. And right now we have these emission control areas in North America, around Puerto Rico, Hawaii, also Baltic and North Sea. So these are the globally IMO mandated emission control areas. However, local jurisdictions can also implement ECA type, emission control area type regulations. And we've seen it being done quite successfully by the 11 Chinese ports, the Bohai and the Yangtze River Delta. So the second type of emissions that comes from maritime sector is called nitrous oxide, NOx. And nitrous oxide is driven not by the quality of fuel, but the actual technical characteristic of the engine itself. And IMO also has regulations regarding the nitrous oxide NOx, and they and of course, carbon dioxide, CO2, right? This is the buzzword. This is something that is on everybody's agendas right now. So we believe that while NOx and SOx are being regulated by the IMO, decarbonization, cutting of CO2 is going to be the main trend for the next decade. So I just mentioned IMO 2020. This was about cutting the sulfur limit of fuels. Now there's IMO 2030, right? And the IMO 2030. This is the initiative to cut CO2, carbon dioxide emissions in maritime sector, and the goals are so ambitious. I think I put them on the slide. You can see that we're talking about a 40% decrease by 2030, about 70% decrease by year 2050. What's also important to understand is that there are many initiatives being discussed in the world right now, how to reach these goals, how to reach maybe even more aggressive goals. The problem with all these initiatives is that sometimes they're in direct conflict with each other. We have different regulators proposing new things. We have different, even on the national level, regional level, different proposals. So I think I just want to walk you through some of the key ones. Of course, in addition to the IMO global initiative, there is a suggestion, obviously it's being discussed right now, and they're moving forward very quickly to include the maritime sector in the European Emissions Trading Scheme, or ETS. So in addition to the European Union proposing this, we also have a number of regional ETS schemas being discussed. Also, there are ideas of how to create some kind of global carbon inventory and accounting mechanisms. And of course, in its simplest form, certain parties are proposing just a straight carbon levy or a tax that will be included in the price of bunker fuel. So if you can switch to the next slide, please. Created a high-level overview in a table format what all of these measures actually entail. So talking about a straight carbon tax, people are proposing a $2 per metric ton levy that will be included in the price of marine fuel. Who's paying? I've included the third column, who's paying. So in this scenario, the price is included in the $2 are included in the price of marine fuel, and then the bunker trader or the bunker physical supplier charges this, and then the carrier ends up paying. So it looks like the ocean carrier, is ultimately paying for this measure. If we're talking about the inclusion of maritime sector in either the regional or the European Union emission trading scheme, again, it looks like the carrier is going to be paying. What right now is not very well clearly defined in any of the proposals is how they're going to be accounted for. All the CO2 emissions. Is it going to be done on a per fleet or per vessel level, and how to do it more accurately, and what's the periodicity, how you do it? And of course, if we're talking about some kind of global CO2 accounting and inventory, we have seen examples of this being created, the attempts of being created in the industrial production, when we collect the data on the factory level. Now, if we take that same mechanism and spread it over the global maritime sector, again, the most important question is who's paying, right? It appears that in all of the four different scenarios, carrier, ocean carrier, be it bulk, tanker, or containerized freight, a container ship line, it looks like the carrier is the one who ultimately pays for all these CO2 initiatives. However, if we can please click and go to the next slide. However, while the carrier who's paying, as we have seen so many times in the industry with IMO 2020, with the introduction of the emission control area back in January of 2015, when carriers are charged an additional levy, that additional levy gets passed through to the shipper, to the beneficial cargo owner, in the form of some kind of surcharge. And we're very used to the term low sulfur surcharge, low sulfur fuel surcharge, emission control area surcharge. That happens all the time throughout history. So all these measures that are being discussed right now, while it may appear that it's going to be the ocean carrier paying for this new initiatives, ultimately it's going to be the shipper. And the big problem is how the costs are going to be passed through. We truly believe that when discussing global CO2 emission reduction initiatives, all the parties in the supply chain need to be involved. That includes obviously, the port infrastructure. That involves the over-the-road part, the ocean carriers, but also the shippers, because for many of these initiatives, the costs need to be spread in a fair and equitable manner. So, if we are to cut down the CO2 emissions, and one of my previous fellow panelists, as he mentioned, the amount of investment required, could be up to $1 trillion. If the number is that big, or whatever number that actually ends up being, we believe that that number needs to, all of the parties in the supply chain need to take care of that number together jointly. So this concludes my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists for presenting. I think it's really great that we've hit on so many topics, from sustainability to the impact the carriers' decisions are having on the ports, digitalization and innovation. These are all things that we're going to continue to discuss throughout the 2 days of this event. So we've got a couple of questions lined up and a little bit of time to ask those. So given that we've heard all of the presentations now and everyone's kind of perspectives, Jordi, starting with you, you had your 4 lessons that could be learned from this year. If you were to pinpoint one thing that you think is most important and one thing that maybe ports really should look at carrying into the future, what would you suggest that be?
In order not to repeat myself with what I said during the presentation and try to summarize it in 1 minute, as I said, global supply chains works. Ports are essential parts for the prosperity of the communities that where we are. No, and what we have learned during this crisis, 2 different things. First, and I'm looking at it from our perspective, the perspective from an European port, a Spanish port, the Catalan port in Barcelona. Diversification has been a success in the port, and we have to go even further in this respect. This is a very good direction in order to help to this prosperity of our community. So diversification is very important, and when it comes to freight port, to logistic port, to passenger port, differentiation is very important. I see all ports. I like to say we are the best in a lot of things, no? But at the end, I see all ports doing very similar things when it comes to digitalization of trains, of of terminals, or automation, robotization. No? So we are going towards the same direction. So we have to do it. We have to be very innovative. We have to do very, very fast in implementing those innovations before the others. Okay, doing it fast in a try and error process, not being afraid of errors. On 4 main pillars: sustainability, multimodality, agilization of the supply chains, resilience and transparency. But, and I will leave it here, going all towards the same direction, trying to be the first, etc. Human capital remains extremely important. Okay, human capital remains extremely important in order to avoid this commoditization of port offers. And we all focus on digitalization, and sometimes we have to think more maybe on human capital, which is going to make the difference among the different port offers on the medium long term.
Thank you so much, Jordi. And Patrick, there, with your membership of international ports across the globe, what has your feedback been in terms of like the big lesson they've all learned, or anything they've adopted this year that's new that could be carried on into the future?
I think the real eye opener was that as I said in the presentation, it's that the slow progress that we've been doing so far on digitalization, and we know that the underlying reason is not technology or even budget. It's trust. It's trust in sharing data and collaborating. And I think that's something that has come out very strongly out of this crisis. That is an absolute priority for the industry going forward. And that has multiple benefits. It's not just digitalization for the sake of digitalization. It has good impact on sustainability as well. An example is like port call optimization. If you can improve that through better data sharing, that reduces emissions and it improves safety. So I think that's really a key target for us as an organization, and I think for many ports individually going forward.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And Eleanor, obviously you've been keeping tabs on the industry throughout the year and the ups and downs. What is the one thing that you think that the industry will kind of take away from this year, from all your market predictions?
I think it's been a particularly challenging year for ports, and I think the takeaway will be that they need to continue to work with all their stakeholders to ensure that service levels remain high. I think probably the takeaway I hope they take is that actually investment in automation and digitalization can actually improve your resilience and can improve your responsiveness to these unforeseen crises. And let's hope that when the ports and terminal operators are cutting their capital expenditure, that they recognise the benefit of some of these incremental investments to the importance of driving sustainability and improving efficiency through the system.
And then on that note, obviously, Yerzhan, highlighting sustainability, how can ports really continue to drive that forward? Not just the shipping lines, because obviously you spoke about that, but the ports themselves, what do they need to learn from this year and continue towards IMO 2030 and beyond?
I think the big takeaway for the entire industry, not just the ports, but also the shipping lines and everybody involved in global supply chains, the biggest takeaway of this most recent crisis is that despite the slowdown in global economy, the regulators are not forgetting about sustainability, and all of these CO2 emission reductions, greenhouse gas emission reductions, they're still underway. They're going to get stricter and stricter. So, in terms of ports, obviously being so key in global supply chains, ports will be in the very forefront, the front of this battle against the CO2 emissions. So I think the key part will be the infrastructure. I think if we're talking about new fuel types, we talked about the sulfur content fuel that's been introduced as of January 2020. That became a global mandate. Also the 0.1% fuel. Unfortunately, even today, not all of the ports in the world are equipped to deliver this type of fuel in quantities required for the industry. not to mention new alternative fuel types such as liquefied natural gas, such as methanol, and all the other fuels that are being tested right now. So definitely, this CO2 reduction initiative needs to involve all of the parties in global supply chains, and ports will play a key role. And the main task for the ports globally will be to provide infrastructure that can provide this new regulation compliant fuel types.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists from all the perspectives concerning the current market, what to expect for the future. I think this has been a really good start to the panel sessions for this event. And for our audience at home, if you've missed any of the topics or any of the discussion, you can check it out on Smart Ports TV on demand. Thank you, everyone.